Well, thank you everyone for attending our first keynote talk with Professor Richard Sylla. Professor Sylla has kindly agreed to talk with us about the topic of was modern economic growth finance-led? And well, if you're just tuning in, this is the Financial History Network webinar series. This is our first keynote talk with Professor Sylla. Professor Sylla is a professor emeritus of economics and the former Henry Kaufman Professor of the History of Financial Institutions and Markets at New York University Stern School of Business. At Stern, Professor Sylla taught courses in financial history, economic and business history of the United States, and comparative enterprise systems since 1990. His primary areas of research include historical studies of money, banking, and finance. He is the author of several books, including The American Capital Market, 1846-1914, published in 1975, A History of Interest Rates, last edited in 2005, Genealogy of American Finance, co-authored with Robert Wright in 2015, and most recently, Alexander Hamilton, The Illustrated Biography, 2016. His writing has appeared in numerous publications, including the Journal of Economic History, Explorations in Economic History, Business History Review, and Enterprise and Society. He is also on the editorial board of many journals that include the Financial History Review, Enterprise and Society, and Economic and Financial History Abstracts. Professor Sylla has been the recipient of several awards and grants, including National Science Foundation grants, an Alfred P. Sloan Foundation grant, and the Citibank Award for Excellence in Teaching at the Stern School. He has served as president of the Economic History Association and the Business History Conference. Professor Sylla is currently the chairman of the Museum of American Finance. He is a fellow of the Cliometric Society and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And without much to say beforehand, Professor Sylla will give his keynote talk. We will be collecting questions and answers. Please enter your questions and answers in the place, the Zoom little window where you can place them. I will be moderating them and placing them in the queue. So without much delay, here is Professor Sylla. Thank you, Vic.
Thank you, Manuel. It's good to be with everyone, even if only electronically. I am in the state of New Hampshire where we're expecting a foot of snow later today and the temperature is very cold. I don't know how the weather is where you all are, but it's cold in the northeastern US, cold and snowy. What I'd like to do today is, start out, let me have a text. If I were a preacher, I would have a text to start every sermon. And the text for my talk today on whether, what can we say about was modern economic growth finance led? The text would be from the economist Joan Robinson, who once said, where enterprise leads, finance follows. That was her way of, I guess, putting down finance. And where enterprise leads, finance follows. And I think what she meant by that was that, well, economies grow, and as they get richer, they develop more complex, articulated financial arrangements. When I looked at history, it seemed to me that almost the opposite was true. That in certain key cases of the history of, let's say, from the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, what I saw as an economic and financial historian was that finance seemed to develop before economic growth became modern and played a key role in that. Sort of, Joseph Schumpeter said, the entrepreneurs are the ones who drive economic development, but the entrepreneurs have to be financed, and the two major actors in Schumpeter's model were the people often talk about the entrepreneur as being key, but if you actually read Schumpeter, the banker was just as important for financing the entrepreneur. So what I want to do today is talk about how I began to develop these ideas. And I guess I'll first talk about the US case, which I studied in great detail and still am studying it. And then some of the foreign cases that I was led to and saw similarities to what happened in the US even before the US had its, what I'll call a financial revolution, and I'll explain what that is. And in particular, I looked at Angus Madison's data once and tried to see, what were the most developed places in the world. And it turned out, what I did was use Madison's data to say, he has a world average of income, and he has various places in the world, and you can compute from Madison's data what were the richest countries relative to the world average. And what I discovered from that is that in 1500, the Italians, and I think he meant the Italian city-states, were the most developed places in the world, having a per capita income sort of twice the world average. And by 1600 and 1700, in the 17th and 18th centuries, it was the Dutch Republic that had the highest per capita income relative to the world average. And it was something like, let me just check some data I have here. I think it was 2.5 to 3.5 times the world average. So they had, gotten beyond the Italian city-states. Then in the 19th century, Britain became the leader relative to the world, and it had 2.5 to, again, 3.5 times the world average. And then in the 20th century, the US was the leader with anywhere from 3.5 to almost 5 times the world average of per capita income. So these were the financial leaders in modern economic history. And when I began to study them, I saw that they had what were financial revolutions sort of before they developed into the high income countries. So I'll talk about those cases. I'll talk about a later case, which is one of my favorites, namely Japan, which I think is the real proof that at least in up to the 20th century, finance really mattered a lot and led economic growth. It's important, I think, to talk about some negative cases, places that might have developed financially but didn't. And the two I'll mention will be France, which didn't develop so much, even though there was an attempt at a financial revolution in the early 18th century. And then Argentina is one that I've looked at as an example. I mentioned Japan as an important case, and I mentioned Argentina. If anyone looked at Argentina and Japan in the late 19th century and had to predict which place will have a great economic future, outpacing the other, I think most of the money would have gone on Argentina. And in fact, the later developments show that Japan really did much better than Argentina. So I think I treat Argentina as a negative case to study. And I want to close my remarks today with a sort of agenda for the future that, that I would like to see more case studies of countries, particular countries, relating their financial development to their economic development. And I think we also need to, when I began to do this stuff 30, 40 years ago, the data were limited for, a certain number of countries had good data going back pretty far. Angus Madison did a lot to help us with that, but I guess his data are being improved now. But it seems to me that in the future, we not only have more financial historians and more national cases to be explored, but we also have better data that will allow the kind of econometric testing. And so we're just beginning to develop this area of research, and there's a lot more room for it to grow. All right, well, how did I get into this study? I was studying the US pretty intensively, and I noticed a lot of very interesting financial developments happened in a very brief period of time right at the beginning of the country, right after the US Constitution was written. And the new government, with George Washington being the first president, came into office in 1789. And his finance minister, called Secretary of the Treasury in the US, was Alexander Hamilton, an old comrade in arms of George Washington in the American Revolution. And Hamilton, I've studied him enough now to know that he was a student of financial history. We should all feel good about the fact that Alexander Hamilton was a great student of financial history. And I won't go into why he became a student of financial history, just tell you he was a student of financial history. And then he proceeded to implement what he had learned from financial history. that he decided that the most important thing for a new country, especially if you were a finance minister of it, was to have sound public finances and public credit and public debt management. And so one of the first things he did in 1790 was to restructure the US Revolutionary War debts and create what we call today the modern US Treasury bond market, which is the very large market in financial history, $20 trillion or so of securities in the hands of the public. So that began under Hamilton in 1790. And the next thing he did was propose that the US have a central bank, central with a small c. It's not the same as a modern central bank, but a sort of bank to be an adjunct of public finance, but also to do a private banking business. So Hamilton sort of believed that a national bank was great for the finances of the government, but it also had the potential to become an important player in financing private economic activity. So he founded the Bank of the United States and called for it in late 1790, and the bank was actually chartered by Congress in 1791. Then he stabilized the currency by defining what the US dollar would be. It was sort of based on the Spanish peso, silver dollar. And so Hamilton basically called for bimetallism, that the US dollar was a certain amount of silver and it was a certain amount of gold. And that stabilized the currency. And then the next thing I noticed was that, when the US government, the new securities came out, the public debt, people were trading them. If you create good financial assets, maybe even not so good financial assets, people want to trade them. And so there's a lot of trading activity in not only the US government debt, but also the equity shares of the very large Bank of the United States. And New York founded the New York Stock Exchange, or the forerunner of it, in 1792. And brokers were trading this debt. And Hamilton also pointed out in his report on a national bank that the government was going to take an ownership share in it, 20%. And he expected that the government would make a profit because the money it borrowed to buy its 20% share in the Bank of the United States, the dividends of the bank would be greater than the interest cost of the loan. And what Hamilton was doing there was telling state government authorities, look, if you charter banks, you can probably profit from them too, because what it costs you to invest in them or tax them or however you're going to use them, you will earn a return greater than your cost of buying into those institutions. And the next thing I noticed was that the state governments began to charter a lot of banks. And the last thing was that they not only chartered other banks, but they chartered a lot of business corporations. There were hardly any corporations chartered in US history up to 1789. There were maybe 20 or so in the 1770s and 80s. And then there were 300 new corporations chartered by state governments in the United States in the 1790s. So basically, I've outlined what I call them. The U.S. didn't really have a modern financial system in 1789, but by the middle of the 1790s, when Hamilton stepped down as Treasury Secretary, it had stable public finances and debt management, number one. Number two, it had stable money. The dollar had been stabilized. Well, it was invented and then stabilized. Number three, it had a central bank, the Bank of the United States. Number four, banking system was developing. Number five, securities markets popped up in New York and Philadelphia and Boston, very shortly in Baltimore. And what was traded on them was reported in newspapers, so we could go back, and this is why I did this in a big project once, to look at what securities were listed and traded in these American cities. And there were a lot of local securities in addition to the national market securities of the US public debt and the stock of the Bank of the United States. And then finally, there were all these corporations being chartered in the US. So there were six key components of a modern financial system: stable public finances, stable money, central bank, banking system, securities markets, and corporations. And I should say that insurance is probably something, I usually count it as a financial corporation, non-bank financial corporation, But I think in financial history, we have to pay more attention to insurance for one important reason. You know, insurance is a way of managing risk. And long before there were articulated modern financial systems, there were various forms of insurance that people developed in, you know, maritime insurance and cases of fire insurance and things like that. Life insurance came a little later. But the key point why I think financial historians should pay more attention to insurance in terms of modern economic growth is that the better ability you have to manage risk, the more risk taking you'll get. You know, if you can manage risk through insurance, maybe you'll take more risks and you'll see more entrepreneurial activity as a result of having better insurance arrangements. So it's not so important for key to economic growth, but in the U.S. case, insurance companies became financial intermediaries, and you know they raised premiums and then they invested. You know, they acted almost like banks in raising funds through insurance premiums and then lending them out to people, investing them in various ways. So anyway, that's the U.S. case. It happened very quickly in the 1790s. And then I began to study earlier cases. I didn't do too much on Italy, but I knew that many modern financial innovations started in medieval and Renaissance Italy. And the Italians were the richest people in the world in 1500. And I noticed that, you know, they had developed public debt markets. They were not like modern public debt markets. It's, you know, the reason was that the Italians were, the city-states of Italy, Venice, Genoa, Florence, and so on, were fighting wars, sometimes with each other, sometimes with the Turks, and they needed to raise money to outfit their armadas, navies. And so they would have what were called forced loans. They would make the rich people of those Italian cities lend money to the government, but in return, they give them securities, and those securities were traded. And they developed banking techniques as well. And I think that they were, you know, financial innovators before there was a lot of financial innovation. But when you get to the Dutch case, it's much clearer that the Dutch made an improvement on the Italians by not forcing rich people in the Netherlands to lend money to the government. This started in the late 16th century and became standardized in the beginning of the 17th century. The Dutch would let the interest rate, you know, they would move the interest rate to whatever it had to be in order to get the money the government needed. So the Dutch developed what I would call the first modern debt market, and Dutch debt of the provinces of the Netherlands. And they needed this money because they were revolting from Spain. And there was this long period of, I think they call it the 70 Years' War or something, from 1570 to 1640, where the Dutch were fighting against Spain for their independence, which they finally gained in the 1640s. The next thing I noticed was that the Dutch started forming corporations. Like in 1600, they brought all of their trading companies together and formed what was called the, you know, in English, the Dutch East India Company. Later on, they had the Dutch West India Company, and these companies were important. I was living in New York when I was thinking about this, and I noticed that it was those two Dutch companies that basically created the colony of New Amsterdam. So the Dutch had public finance and corporations, and then I noticed that they stabilized their guilder currency. It became a stable money early in the 17th century, and it remained stable through the 17th and 18th centuries. They founded the Bank of Amsterdam as a sort of central bank. It was not anything like a modern central bank. It wasn't even much like a modern bank. It was sort of an exchange bank that created a better form of money than the clipped gold and silver coins it was dealing with. So they had a bank at the center of their system. They had a rudimentary banking system. They were called cashiers, I guess, in English. But they really developed their securities markets. And I noticed that the Bank of Amsterdam was founded in 1609 and the Amsterdam Stock Exchange was founded in the same year. So what I saw was that, say, at the end, from the end of the 16th century to about 1620, the beginning of the 17th century, the Dutch had a financial revolution. The same things that happened in the US very quickly in the 1790s happened in 2 to 3 decades in the Dutch Republic. And then after that, the Dutch had their golden age. Their golden age was kind of in the middle of the 17th century, and the Dutch were the richest country in the 17th and 18th centuries. Simon Schama called this history the embarrassment of riches. The Dutch became very rich after they had their financial revolution. The next case is the British, of course. And I don't have to say much about that because Dixon wrote a book called The Financial Revolution in England, and he dated it from 1688 into the 1740s. And it involved stabilizing the public finances of Britain, developing a good public debt market. The Bank of England was founded in 1694. They had corporations like the East India Company, the Bank of England, the South Sea Company, other companies that were formed in the sort of late 17th, early 18th century. They stabilized their money. Even Sir Isaac Newton had a little bit of as master of the mint, was involved in reforming the British currency, kind of went on the gold standard, stabilized their money. They had banks already existing in London, the London private bankers, and then by the middle of the 18th century, the country banking system of Britain began. And securities markets developed in Britain. So Britain had a financial revolution stretched out over a bit more time. And just as the Dutch Golden Age came after the financial revolution, in Britain, the Industrial Revolution, most people dated from after 1750, so after the financial revolution. So those 3 cases that, and Hamilton studied the Italian cases and the Dutch case and the British case, and to some extent learned from that when he did his reforms in the US. Then I discovered Japan. Japan is really an interesting case for economic historians because it was so isolated from the world for 2 to 3 centuries. From about 1600 or so, they closed themselves off from the world, and then they were opened up in the middle of the 19th century. And that caused a lot of turmoil in Japan, and they had a revolution in the 1860s, so the Meiji Revolution, where the modernizers took over from the old Tokugawa regime. And then I noticed, what did the Japanese do? They stabilized their public finances. In their case, they had to switch from rice taxes to money taxes. In the 1870s, they did that and created a public debt market. Then they used the public debt to sort of commute the rice payments that the peasants of Japan had to pay the samurai and other nobles and so on. They converted them to cash payments. And then to buy off the samurai, they issued public debt to them. And the next thing you know, so samurai have a lot of public debt instead of being paid in rice, and they begin to invest in banks and become entrepreneurs. It's a case of a military class becoming an entrepreneurial class, partly because the government gave them a lot of public debt. The Tokyo and Osaka stock exchanges both were founded in 1878 to trade this debt. There was monetary turmoil in Japan, banking turmoil in the 1870s, but by 1880, the early 1880s, a man named Matsukata became the finance minister, and he stabilized the money. He actually promoted an inflation. He founded the Bank of Japan as a central bank in 1882. There was a Japanese banking system was forming and reforming in this period. The yen currency, of course, was introduced. So essentially the same things that you see in the Netherlands in the early 17th century and in Britain in the early 18th century and in the US at the end of the 18th century, the same set of institutions I've been talking about is created in Japan. And the next thing you know, Japan is running away from the rest of East Asia and South Asia in terms of its economic development. Along the way, I noticed that France, under John Law in 1720, tried to have a financial revolution. Law understood what was going on in Britain. He tried to bring the same things to France. Won't go into the details, but basically he was, introducing his corporations and paper money and stabilizing the public finances and forming a bank and corporations, of course, but it all blew up in the Mississippi bubble of 1720. And historians have said that, the failure of John Law made France suspicious of financial innovations for the next century or so, and it lagged behind Britain. Britain, of course, had its financial innovations because it was fighting wars with France, and Britain won all of its wars with France. I think Neil Ferguson once told me that, well, or maybe wrote that the reason Britain defeated France in its wars is because it could borrow 3 times as much money at 1/3 the interest cost. And that's an important point. It's nice because most of this financial innovation of the 17th, 18th, maybe even the Italians in the earlier 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries was due to needs of war. That's why I placed public finance first. The Dutch were fighting for their independence against Spain. The British were fighting wars against France. The Americans ran up a big debt and then had to restructure it after they fought a war of independence against Britain. In the Japanese case, it wasn't so much a war, but the humiliation that came from being opened up in the 1850s and realizing that they were behind the rest of the world. So they consciously decided, how do we catch up? And they sent the delegations out to study the US and Western Europe. And that's where they learned the importance of finance, and they had their own financial revolution. When I looked at Argentina at the same time, Argentina had a lot of natural resources and an enterprising population. They brought in most of their capital from outside, and there wasn't a lot of domestic financial development. It seemed to me when I studied what happened in Argentina through the works of Carlos Marechal and others, what you find is that the government was involved in establishing some banks, but just a few of them, mortgage banks and commercial banks. As I thought about it, I said, well, if the government is really forming these, and there weren't very many of them, they relied too much on the finance from outside the country. And when they had a little political instability, the foreign capital would leave, and they hadn't developed a domestic financial system. So they had a pretty good run in the early 20th century based on foreign capital, but they didn't do a lot to develop their domestic financial system in the way the other countries I had talked about did. And so that becomes a case of, a very promising economic situation that didn't seem to work out because the financial arrangements were not all that good. There was one case in the 1880s that I particularly was interested in. They formed something called a national guaranteed banks, where the government borrowed a lot of money overseas, or guaranteed a lot of loans from overseas, and the financial institutions that were formed, these guaranteed banks, paid the government much less than the government had borrowed, and then proceeded to issue money all the way up to the amount that was borrowed. And this struck me as very similar to wildcat banking. Now, wildcat banking was considered an aberration in US history, but it seemed to become public policy in Argentina. I thought that was interesting, that they had a sort of wildcat banking feature of Argentina develop. Anyway, the Argentine financial system didn't develop, and Japan did much better than Argentina did, even though it was much less promising in the late 19th century. All right, well, I think I'm getting toward the end of my half hour that I was told to stick to, and leave plenty of time for questions, and I always enjoy these question periods. So let me just wrap up this idea that, Joan Robinson was wrong, at least about the history of the 16th and 20th centuries. It's better to say where finance leads, enterprise follows. There seems to be a strong relationship between having a financial revolution, installing a modern financial system, maybe in a relatively brief time of history, and subsequent economic development. And what's the agenda for the future? Well, I think we need more case studies. I circulated a background paper that Peter Rousseau and I had written, and there we talked about some of these case studies that I've talked about today. And the historians can do a lot to develop these ideas, and but they have to, I think if there's any use to what my own work has shown, it's that I've laid out a framework. When you study a country, look at its public finances, look at whether it has a stable currency. Did they come up with some sort of central bank with a small c? Some institution that is at the head of the banking system. Did they develop a banking system? Did they develop securities markets? Did they make it easy for businesses to form corporations? Because that seems to be, I would say, the distinctive feature of US development, which I discovered after I wrote co-authored that paper with Peter Rousseau, was that the US was most different in developing these corporations. It copied earlier. Hamilton was a student of financial history, and he sort of knew what the Dutch did and what the British did, and did that in the US. What was really interesting about the US is where the Dutch had a few corporations, the British had a limited number of corporations. The US began to develop corporations all over the place, and maybe 30,000 were chartered by the time of the Civil War, and by the early 20th century there are 300,000 corporations in the US, far more than other countries. And that became, to my mind, one of the really distinctive features. So I think we need to look, and when we do these cases, to see whether these countries make it easy for people in them to, all countries, how easy was it to form a corporation? Corporations are very useful for pooling capital, and banks are corporations in most cases. So we need to have more of these case studies, and then as our data improve, we did a rudimentary thing in that paper I circulated. We sort of said, let's measure, the data we had allowed one measure of financial development, basically the ratio of money to GDP. It's kind of the inverse of the velocity of money. And we called it financial depth. But the ratio of money to GDP is really a very simple idea for measuring financial development. Given the richness of what we know about banking systems and public finance and securities markets and corporations, we need to get data on that so we have a much richer idea of variables that might indicate financial development. And so I'm basically calling for still more national case studies, maybe guided by this idea that we want to look for what we want to see what a modern financial system is and see how it happened in this country. And I'm a great believer in comparative economic history. So if you study, Gerschenkron told me when I was his student that you can't know one country unless you know at least two. And therefore, I encourage people who are interested in, say, the economic history of Spain to compare the economic history of Spain and financial development with maybe some nearby country, maybe Portugal or maybe France or whatever, or maybe with one of these canonical cases I've talked about today. So that's my agenda for the future, that I think it is interesting to historically to realize that finance may have led modern economic growth. It seems to be less clear in our age of globalization, where you can have a lot of borrowing of financial technology from other countries. But still, I think when we study the history, we need more cases of national case studies and better data, and test these hypotheses, which is a field of study that's relatively new, but it has a lot of promise for the future. I'll stop there and take questions. Thank you for your attention.
Very good. Thank you, Dick, for this great talk. So we have two people who have joined as panelists just to make their questions. One is Noam Mager. Noam, if you can turn on your mic and your camera to make your question, and then Professor Carlos Barichal from Mexico will also make their questions.
Carlos, hello.
Hello. Should I go first?
Yes, please.
So, hi, Richard. I promise I put on my hoodie before I knew I'd be on video today. Now I realize this is fashion for today, even though we're not expecting a foot of snow in London today. My question has to do with Hamilton, the prophet of finance, versus Hamilton, the prophet of industrial policy and developmentalism, thinking about the report on manufacturing. So if you could think a little bit about, or help us think a little bit about the relationship between, on one hand, yes, you need the financial infrastructure, but at the same time, Hamilton was a prophet of state intervention, state developmentalism, the developmental state, tariffs, incentives. So if you can think, help us think a little bit about the relationship between these two Hamiltons. You might have heard about the Radical Hamilton book that came out recently. And clearly there are also, I think recently, echoes of Hamilton in Latin America and elsewhere. So if you can elaborate a little bit on that, I think that would be interesting.
Yeah, well, I think, thanks for the question, Noam. I think Hamilton, believed in what the thesis of the lecture is today, that finance leads economic growth. And he was very much interested in having economic development. And for the United States, he felt like, we should have, the government should do what it can to foster industrialization. I mean, I think Alfred Chandler or people at the Harvard Business School once said that Hamilton's report on manufacturers was sort of a guide of how you develop a undeveloped or underdeveloped country. Finance, of course, was an important part of it. If you actually read the report on manufacturers, in it, Hamilton is saying that financial reforms he was developing at the time would really be good for industrialization. That, in fact, he said that by creating a really rock solid U.S. Public debt, that created collateral for businessmen to, the ones who owned the public debt could go in and collateralize their public debt to get loans from banks, or the public debt really being good. It was almost like an addition to the currency. And so this was going to help people found businesses. And so I think basically Hamilton's financial reforms were directed at aiding the kind of industrial development he wanted to see for the US. And this was rather controversial at the time. And, I've read Christian Parenti's book. He sent it to me even before it was published and asked me for a blurb for it, and I furnished one. So I think he's, to my mind, it's not such an earth-shattering book in the sense that he's telling me something I already knew, but he wants to sort of say that Hamilton was an industrial planner. Well, I would say he was an industrial encourager. He wanted most of this development to be private, but he wanted the government to aid it. And I think he knew that, the U.S. was a young country, and other countries had a lead, particularly Britain had a lead on the U.S. in manufacturing. But so he wanted to say, how can you catch up? And one way was to, government aid to manufacturers. He sometimes thought to be a high tariff guy, but his tariffs were really very low. Hamilton was not a high tariff guy. He proposed subsidies to manufacturing, and because he knew that subsidies were more efficient than tariffs and giving the encouragement without taxing your own citizens so much. So Hamilton was a low tariff guy, but he did want to have subsidies. I think, the U.S., the historians say that Hamilton's report fell on deaf ears. That's not exactly true. Almost all of his tariff reforms were enacted a few months later, not for Hamilton's reasons, though, but because the U.S. government needed more money. So they enacted his tariff proposals, that report on manufacturers. They didn't go for the subsidies, but U.S. basically followed this Hamilton idea of government-aided industrialization, usually through higher tariffs in the early 19th century. The reason I think it's important is because Hamilton's ideas spread around the world. Most people think that Hamilton was a U.S. reformer, but in fact, he had his followers even after he died in the U.S., and they kept his ideas alive. And people like Friedrich List, the German economist, came to America, lived there for a while, made some good money by investing his money in American stocks. And then he went back to Germany and wrote a book on the national system of political economy, which was basically taking a lot of Hamilton's ideas and saying, this is what we need to do in Germany. And Germany followed some of those ideas and developed. There's a story that when the Japanese delegation came to visit Germany in the 1870s or early 1880s, they said, you know, we see Germany's developing very rapidly. We want to do that too. How can we do it? And supposedly Bismarck, the boss man of Germany, reached up on his bookshelf and pulled off List's book, which is full of Hamilton's ideas, and gave it to the Japanese and said, this is how you do it. And we know that List was very important in the industrializers of Russia at the same time, at the late 19th and early 20th century. And when you look at the 20th century, the sort of Asian tigers, you know, Korea, Taiwan, places like that, Singapore, they're basically following a government-guided policy, a sort of Hamiltonian policy, and that's in great distinction, you know, contradistinction to the usual liberal idea of the government should get out of the way and let private enterprise take over. That's not really the way the modern world developed. I mean, the modern world develops and continues to develop, I think, more through Hamilton's approach of government-aided industrialization than it does through free markets and minimal government. So what Hamilton did, I mean, you know, his finance was part of his industrial or economic development plan. And it's not only helped the US, but it spread from the US to other places.
So next we have Professor Marichal, and then I'll take some questions from the audience, and maybe some will make their questions themselves.
Well, a great talk, Richard. Thank you for that. It's a splendid summary. Now, within the model of a financial revolution, you talked about successful financial revolutions, and you mentioned all of these cases. But I have a question about partial financial revolutions. In other words, to what extent within that very large concept, we can also talk about other types of advances in financial development. For instance, isn't it possible to speak of a banking revolution, particularly commercial and banking, around, I was thinking a lot about the 1850s and 1860s as a key takeoff, particularly for Western Europe. I mean, because in Germany, France, Belgium, Italy, and so forth, the enormous number of banks are created. Obviously, the US and Great Britain had many more banks before that. And that period is also important for other regions, Australia, Canada, the creation of banks, without necessarily having all of the other components very well constituted. And in the case of Latin America, I've been looking at it, and between 1850 and 1873, there were at least 100 commercial banks set up. Many of them are small, some of them are fairly large. But anyway, that period, that mid-century, isn't it a period of banking revolution?
Yeah, I think, I mean, as I recall, David Landis in his book on, you know, industrialization of Europe, I forget what the exact title was, but David Landis talked about a financial revolution of the mid-19th century in Europe, and it had a lot to do, and my friend Rondo Cameron also talked about that, and, you know, France was one of the key innovators with his Credit Mobilier concept. I guess that was based to some extent on a Belgian bank in the 1830s, what Société Générale or something like that in the 1830s. And then the German Grossbanken, you know, universal banks kind of copied the idea too. It's the idea that banks not only engage in commercial banking business, but they also do some in investment banking business. So that was part of this banking revolution of the middle of the 19th century. And certainly that was, you know, when you say a partial financial revolution, I say, yeah, and that's what I'm calling for, to see whether maybe the Italian city-states show that if you have some of these, but not all of these components of a fully articulated modern financial system, you can still do pretty well. And but another point, though, I would make is that, you know, I was brought up with Gerschenkron and Cameron, who talked a lot about banks. But the more I studied financial history, I said, well, the whole story isn't banks. I mean, it's monetary stabilization and solid public finances and securities markets and corporations. And these things really interact with each other. And another thing is, we often say that Germany, even Japan, were cases of bank-led industrialization. But if you actually studied the economic history of those places, you find quickly that the German securities markets were pretty big. You find that the Japanese securities markets were pretty big around the turn of the 20th century. So banks were important, but I think it's, it may be what you said, a partial financial revolution, but it's better to have a full-blown financial revolution, I think, because these components of the financial system reinforce each other. If you have a good public debt market, it makes it easier for corporations to issue debt. It makes it easier for corporations to issue equity if you have a good securities market functioning. And key, of course, is government stability. I think, Schumpeter, when he said banks and entrepreneurs are what matter, he was sort of assuming that you had a stable government. You can't always assume that in the world today.
Thank you. So we will have now Mark Stigl and Anders Ukren ask their questions themselves. Mark, if you can turn on your camera and your mic.
There. Okay. My question relates to the land banks that were chartered by many colonies in the U.S., or at least a few colonies prior to the Constitution's enactment and Hamilton's arrival on the scene. Just specifically, whether in your view those were precursors in any way, or whether they were really throwbacks to an earlier model. Thanks.
Well, I think they were an important financial innovation, and I've done a long time ago. I did a little bit of study of that. I mean, the point was that the Americans, not Western Europe, but the Americans were the first one in the Western world to come up with this fiat paper money, starting with Massachusetts in 1690. And then the idea that the state government could issue paper money, it's spread quickly, and it was originally just to pay some soldiers who hadn't been paid, and the money was given some value by saying it would be accepted in public taxes. But the American colonies were very rapidly growing, and so the paper money was actually an innovation to finance their growth. And these were called bills of credit. And then a variant of that was what you mentioned, Mark, the land banks. They came up, and basically Americans had a lot of land and little capital. So the Americans basically wanted to take out mortgages. I'll pledge my land if you give me some for a loan of money, and then I'll be able to improve my land, say, or engage in some other venture. So these land banks issued paper money. They were government sponsored, colonial governments sponsored them. They issued paper money. And again, the money served a use of just to finance the expansion of the commercial economy. And so these two, bills of credit and land bank notes were important financial innovations, but they could be overdone. And that's what happened in the American Revolution. The idea that the government could issue a lot of paper money and finance a war of independence against Britain, that was just a conclusion. But by the time that the US actually won its independence, there had been a terrible inflation. And so you see the American leaders of the 1780s saying, we got to really be careful with this paper money. I think it served a great purpose when they did it. It financed a lot of, the paper money financed a lot of trade and entrepreneurship in colonial America, but it was something that was liable to abuse. And so in the early US, the idea that the states would issue their own money was taken away by the Constitution, which did not say the federal government couldn't issue paper money, which it did, but it removed the states lost something from not being able to issue their own fiat currencies. But Hamilton persuaded them that you can charter banks and you'll get a benefit from that. So I mean, I wouldn't call it a throwback to anything. I would call it a financial innovation that took place in probably what was the most rapid growing economy of world. We know that just because the American population was growing at 3% a year. So if GDP per capita stayed the same, you had 3% overall economic growth, and you needed that extra money. So it served its purpose, but by the time the US was set up, people realized there are certain dangers in it as well. So they got away from it.
Thank you.
Johnny Toniolo.
So first we will have Professor Anders Ögren, and then we will have Professor Gianni Toniolo ask their questions. So if you can please turn on your mics when you talk. Thank you.
Hello, Anders.
Hello, Dick. It's good to see you, even if it's on distance. So, yeah, I just wanted to add the fact that you left out Sweden. As you know, we have quite a lot of evidence of a finance-led growth in Sweden as well. And sort of that relates to my question.
Well, you were the main researcher that's making that point. I should have mentioned that too, but I want everybody to read what Anders has written about Sweden and then do it for whatever country you're interested in.
Well, one of the things that I wanted to add to discussion was this with the possibilities of entry to the market. The fact that what I think is important here also is that it's a lot of activity from below. Banks are actually popping up and insurance companies are popping up. So it's a question about the right to establish financial ventures. So this is this balance. And then the question is there a framework that the state is providing that provides the possibility to establish financial ventures? And in a longer perspective, what are the kind of lessons for regulatory regimes or regulations today that we can take from this?
Well, I think I adverted to that briefly in my talk when I said that, you know, moving beyond the 2003 paper that I circulated as background, that didn't talk a lot about the ease of forming corporations. And you're talking about the ease of forming financial institutions. I think, you know, that is important. That's one of the things we should study. I mentioned corporations, but it might be joint stock companies or partnership laws or things like that. But, you know, a big difference between countries might be how easy it is to form these financial institutions and other types of corporations. And I also mentioned that, you know, in Argentina, I think maybe one of the problems was that the state got so involved in forming major financial institutions that it discouraged private parties from forming those institutions. And you know, that might have been because the state wanted to protect its own institutions. John Wallace and I studied early American banking, and we found that in a state like Pennsylvania, which had big investments in its banks, it didn't want to have too many banks because then you know, the competition might reduce the dividends the state got from the banks that it invested in. So I think that's another important point when we're studying these comparative financial developments, to say, you know, if a government gets too involved in forming financial institutions, it may have an interest in suppressing competition. So I would agree with you that we should study how easy it is to enter the financial industry, that the differences between countries could be, you know, relevant for financial and economic development.
Thanks.
Hello, Johnny.
Professor Toniolo.
Oh, you're muted, Johnny. Turn on.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you. Hello.
Okay. I start with this the cover of this nice book by Stefano Ugolini. You see the picture is the picture of a square near Rialto in Venice, where we can argue, and scholars argue, that the real first central bank was established in 1587. And it is a central bank in the sense that it was created by the government and was meant both to stabilize the currency and, most important, lending of last resort, stabilizing the banking system. So my little question is a curiosity. You said that Hamilton was a scholar. He read a lot of financial history. Do you know whether he was aware of this or not?
I don't know whether he was aware of that particular bank, but he did, when he was saying that the U.S. needed to have a national bank, he did mention that, you know, England, of course, had the Bank of England, and he mentioned Sweden, but he did say, you know, Venice and Hamburg and other places. He mentioned specifically Venice was a place where they had established a sort of national bank. I don't think he named it and gave the date, but he had actually come across it in his readings, you know, and of course in his whole life, he had never been to Europe. You know, everything he learned was from reading, and you know, people try to say, who was he reading? And I think somebody that gets ignored is that he read a guy named Sir James Stewart, who had done a lot of writing about European financial development. You know, and after Adam Smith, nobody read Sir James Stewart, but Alexander Hamilton read Sir James Stewart before he read Adam Smith, which is why he didn't think Adam Smith was such a great innovator in economics. But you know, he did mention Venice, Johnny, as an example of a country that had a national bank.
So I will group three questions that are sort of closely related by Juan Jose Rivas Moreno from LSE, Ernie Englander, and an anonymous attendee. And they all have to do with how rigid this model is. So Juan Jose asks, could we be following a too normative or rigid model of financial evolution from public debt to central banks onto corporations? He is particularly considering the case of the Roman Empire, which created many of the financial institutions still in use today. Then Ernie Englander he said that he taught Hamilton 2 weeks ago, and now his students are asking about GameStop. So what sort of economic development is this sort of modern finance taking us? And then the anonymous attendee's question is very closely related to Ernie Englander's. And he or she said, do you see any financial innovation around that can have a deep impact similar to the cases mentioned?
Do I see any today, you mean? Any?
Yes.
All right, well, that's kind of three different questions, but on Rome, I know that the Romans had a certain financial development, but I'm not sure it was kind of as complete as what I would call the modern financial system. But that, you know, I don't know enough about that. My friend Peter Temin has written a lot about Roman economic development. I would just say that I think it would be fun to apply these ideas to the ancient world and to see to what extent that they had financial development and whether it mattered. You know, sometimes one idea from economic history that I remember is that the Romans, you know, weren't so interested in developing their economy because they had slave labor. They could rely on slaves to do everything. So respectable people in Rome didn't really engage in finance and trade that much. You know, they were warriors and land farmers, I guess. Ernie's question was about GameStop, was it?
Yes, about GameStop.
Yeah. Well, I think Hamilton knew, you know, when I read Hamilton, he says, you know, yeah, sometimes finance gets a little wild and can even go off the rails, but that's you know, that's maybe one of its features that, you know, somebody said, well, Afghanistan never had a financial crisis because it, you know, basically never had a financial system. But that was said a long time ago. Maybe it's different now. But, you know, so I mean, it's human nature, I think, that does these things. And we want to make the financial architecture so it doesn't blow up. And, you know, Hamilton himself had to deal with a financial crisis both in 1791 and 1792. And I've written about it. He handled it more or less like a central banker. I think these are, you know, these things happen periodically, financial crises, panics, and so on. But, you know, they are not the main point. They're not the main story. They're features of the financial system that we would like to control as much as we can. But, you know, we shouldn't let the wild things that happen every now and then deter us from you know, thinking that finance is not as important as it actually is. The last question had to do, or do we see any of these things going on today? Well, I mentioned the financial development in East and Southeast Asia. I mean, the Asian tigers, I think, You know, the Koreans, for example, the Taiwanese, they've developed a lot of these institutions and followed Hamilton's sort of policies. The big question might be, if we look at China today, you know, China has obviously made great leaps and bounds. I've been surprised because I don't know of many cases in history where somebody had, you know, 40 years of solid economic growth with hardly any setbacks. And I've taught in China a couple times some years back, and you know, they weren't too happy about their financial system. The banks have a lot of bad debts and all that. So is China a case that maybe challenges what I'm saying? Well, I'm not so sure. I mean, there's a lot of, you know, foreign capital flowing into China, and direct investment as well as portfolio investment. So China, you know, they do have a lot of big banks. I would say that, you know, they may have a A or A- manufacturing system, and they have a you know, B-, C+ financial system. They're developing that system as rapidly, and I think they borrowed a lot of ideas from previous financial history. So I'm not sure it's an exception to my case, but you know, I think there is a sort of heavy state involvement, which makes me suspicious. You know, they say the innovation and the growth in China are from the private sector, and the state-owned companies and state-owned banks aren't having much to do with it. I think China may run into trouble if they try to suppress private financial development in order to protect their state-owned institutions. But so far, they've handled it pretty well. But I mean, these are questions. I mean, I'm providing a framework, and we can take that framework and see how well it applies. And that's what we should do. You know, maybe I'm wrong on what's really important. But I do see this, and you know, in these 17th, 18th, 19th century cases, they seem, there's a lot of parallels. There's pretty close fit.
Very good. Thank you, Dick, for your time and giving us this amazing keynote. Thank you, everyone, for attending our keynote today. We will be resuming our paper presentations in 2 weeks' time with Frederick Steinfeld's paper. And we thank everyone for attending today's keynote talk. On behalf of the Financial History Network, we thank you all for coming. Thanks.
Thank you.